The desert had always been a place that tested people, but this time the test was planned. A team of researchers had gathered at the Arava Desert Research Facility to study how humans could survive in extreme heat, dryness, and sudden storms. Global weather patterns were becoming unpredictable, and scientists feared that future environments might resemble the harshest deserts on Earth. To prepare for that possibility, they designed an experiment they called the Sandstorm test. It was supposed to be controlled, safe, and closely monitored. But nature rarely follows human plans. Among the volunteers was a quiet botanist named Elias Mora, someone who preferred plants to people and silence to attention. He had come to the desert months earlier to study unusual species that survived in dry climates. Many people on the research team thought he was strange, not in a bad way, but in an unusual one. He spent hours sitting beside shrubs, touching their leaves, talking to them under his breath, and taking notes as if each plant were a friend with a story to tell. When the team first announced the survival experiment, Elias surprised everyone by signing up immediately. Volunteers in the Sandstorm test were each allowed to choose a shelter. Most picked reinforced fiberglass pods, heat-shielded domes, or compact metallic rooms designed to withstand strong winds. These were based on prototypes for future desert housing. But Elias asked for something unexpected. He wanted to stay inside the giant succulent the team had recently discovered. The succulent had been found weeks before the experiment by a pair of field workers. It was unlike anything they had seen before, taller than a person, with thick, curved lobes, and a natural cavity inside that was big enough for someone to crawl into. The plant stored huge amounts of water and had a rubbery exterior that protected it from heat. Researchers believed it was thousands of years old, surviving because it adapted better than other plants around it. To the team, it was a botanical miracle. To Elias, it felt like a living shelter that nature itself had designed. When he first suggested that he wanted to conduct his 24-hour survival test inside the plant, several team members laughed, thinking he was joking. But Elias wasn't smiling. He calmly explained that the plant had an internal temperature far cooler than the outside environment. The cavity inside stayed humid, and its air seemed to be partially filtered through its walls. And most importantly, the plant was stable and rooted deep in the sand. It had survived storms for centuries. He believed that if nature had created a shelter, humans should try to learn from it. The senior researchers hesitated. It wasn't a normal request. One manager worried it might damage the plant. Another said it might not be safe for Elias if the cavity collapsed or his oxygen levels dropped unexpectedly. But Elias insisted that he understood the plant better than anyone else at the facility. He had spent more time studying it than all the researchers combined. Eventually, after checking the structure and setting up a small monitor device to track his oxygen, they agreed to let him do it. On the morning of the experiment, the desert felt calm, almost too calm. The sun rose slowly, spreading gold across the sand. Volunteers checked their equipment, technicians tested communication devices, and drones hovered above, ready to observe the shelters from the air. Everyone followed the routine with quiet excitement. It was supposed to be a long, scientific, but uneventful day. Elias walked toward the succulent carrying only a small backpack. Inside were a water bottle, a soft mat to lie on, a sensor panel, and a small flashlight. He had turned down offers for more equipment. When someone asked him why, he simply said he wanted to understand the plant's natural environment without too much interference. He didn't want technology to distract him from what he was trying to learn. The succulent stood slightly apart from the rest of the testing area, near a cluster of low dunes. Its green skin glowed faintly under the morning light, and the texture looked almost like wax. Elias approached it gently, the same way one approaches something alive and delicate. He ran his hand across its surface, feeling the coolness that never made sense in such scorching weather. It always amazed him. He crouched down and opened the natural gap the researchers had widened earlier. The opening led to a hollow space inside. The air coming out was damp, as if he were entering a room with a built-in humidifier. It smelled earthy and faintly sweet. Not unpleasant, just different. Before he crawled in, a technician called out to him, reminding him to check his oxygen monitor regularly. Another reminded him to stay awake during the hottest hours. Elias nodded politely, though he already knew he wouldn't follow that advice strictly. He was too curious about how the environment inside the plant would naturally shift over the day. He slipped inside, pulling the soft mat with him and settling into the curved interior. The space wasn't big enough to stand, but it felt like a natural cradle, snug and strangely welcoming. The walls glistened with moisture, and every sound he made, the rustle of the mat, the movement of his hands, echoed gently. He pressed his palm against the wall. It felt alive. Not moving, but definitely breathing in its own way. Outside, the team began their countdown. Cameras clicked. Drones took their positions. The experiment had officially begun. The first hour passed quietly. Elias lay on his mat, his head resting against the plant's interior wall. He watched the small screen of his oxygen monitor blink softly. The numbers were stable. Inside, the temperature was cooler than he expected. The plant insulated him from the heat outside, just as he had hoped. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the succulent. It was probably just the movement of water inside its tissues. But to Elias, it sounded almost musical. He thought about his childhood and how he had always preferred the company of nature. While other children played games or chased each other, he spent afternoons examining leaves, observing insects, or building small shelters out of branches. His parents used to worry that he was too quiet, too withdrawn. But Elias believed that quiet was a type of strength. The desert, in its silence, made sense to him. Hours passed. Outside, the volunteers and engineered shelters were adjusting to the heat waves, checking their communication panels, wiping sweat from their foreheads. Some of them were already uncomfortable. But inside the plant, Elias felt steady. The plant's natural humidity softened the air. The temperature didn't fluctuate wildly. And somehow, even though the space was small, he didn't feel trapped. He felt safe. He made notes in a small book, detailing the moisture level on the walls, the stability of temperature, and the slow, subtle movement of air. Every hour, he checked his oxygen sensor. The levels shifted slightly, but not dangerously. The plant was more complex than anyone at the facility initially understood. Around the 6th hour, Elias started to drift. The air felt heavy, but calming. The constant low hum of water inside the succulent lulled him into a relaxed state. He tried to stay awake, remembering the technician's warning. But his eyelids grew heavier. Inside the plant, it felt like dusk, even though it was still daytime outside. The darkness was soothing, like being wrapped inside a cocoon. He didn't mean to fall asleep, but his body relaxed, and before long, he slipped into a quiet slumber without even realizing it. Outside, the sky began to shift. The weather monitors picked up unusual movement in the atmosphere, something that wasn't supposed to happen that day. Winds started to gather far beyond the dunes, moving faster than predicted. A technician noticed the reading and frowned. He alerted the researchers, who looked at the screens with growing concern. The Sandstorm test was no longer going according to plan. Inside the succulent, Elias slept peacefully, unaware that the desert around him was about to change into something far more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. The desert changed faster than anyone expected. One moment the sky was clear, pale blue, and harmless. The next, a strange darkness began to spread at the far edge of the horizon. It looked first like a thin line of smoke, but within minutes, it grew into a thick wall of dust moving toward the research area. The technicians monitoring the weather screens stared in disbelief. None of the forecast models had shown anything like this. The storm seemed to appear out of nowhere, almost as if it had been hiding behind the dunes waiting for the right moment. Inside the control tent, people rushed from one screen to another, trying to understand what they were seeing. A senior researcher whispered that the storm looked bigger than anything they had previously recorded in that region. Another pressed her hands against her forehead, realizing that the volunteers were already out there, locked inside their chosen shelters. And among them was Elias, sleeping quietly inside the giant succulent. Completely unaware of the danger growing outside, the wind arrived first a low, deep sound like distant thunder rolling across the sand. It made the walls of the testing domes tremble. Technicians exchanged worried looks. One of them tried contacting the volunteers through their communication panels, but the signals were starting to weaken. Static filled the speakers. The storm was interfering with everything: radios, satellites, even the drones that were supposed to hover above the site. The volunteers inside the engineered shelters felt the first wave of wind shake their structures. One volunteer pressed his palms against the metal wall of his chamber, startled by how hot it felt from the outside. Another tried tightening her harness straps, reminded of the instructions they had been given: stay calm, stay low, and wait for further directions. But no one had warned them about a storm like this. Their shelters were designed for regular desert storms, nothing this powerful. Meanwhile, Elias slept inside the plant, his breathing slow and steady. The interior of the succulent was dark and humid, muffling all sounds from outside. The thick, water-storing walls acted like natural insulation. Even as the wind outside picked up speed, the plant barely moved. It swayed gently, like a heavy tree refusing to give in to the wind's force. The air inside stayed cool, almost soothing, creating a peaceful cocoon around the sleeping botanist. Dust clouds began to swallow the testing area. The sun disappeared behind a thick brown curtain, and the temperature dropped sharply. Sand scraped across the shelters, hitting them with a sharp metallic hiss. The volunteers huddled inside, some whispering prayers, some gripping the edges of their seats. A few tried talking to each other through their communication panels, but most couldn't get any signal through. In the control tent, warnings blared loudly. The storm had reached dangerous speeds, far beyond what their shelters were built to handle. One of the researchers shouted that they needed to abort the experiment, but there was no safe way to retrieve anyone. The storm outside was too strong. Anyone who stepped into it would be thrown off their feet in seconds. They had no choice but to hope the shelters held. Elias finally stirred, waking up slowly as the plant shifted slightly under the force of the storm. At first, he thought the movement was just the wind, something normal for the desert. He blinked, adjusting to the dimness inside the plant. The air still felt humid and calm. He checked his oxygen monitor numbers steady. Nothing seemed wrong inside his small living pocket. But the faint rumbling outside grew louder, and he pressed his ear against the plant's inner wall. He heard something, like 1,000 grains of sand hitting the surface in fast bursts. A strange vibration traveled through the plant, but it didn't break or shake violently. Instead, it tightened slightly around him, as if bracing itself. Elias frowned. The plant had never behaved like this before. It was reacting to the environment, adapting the way natural organisms do. He tried reaching for the communication device placed near the plant's opening, but the signal was weak. All he heard was static. He called out anyway, hoping someone on the other end could hear him. There was no response. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Sand flew horizontally, thick enough to block visibility completely. The testing domes, made of reinforced materials, began to creak under the pressure. One dome's outer layer peeled away like paper, exposing its inner frame. The volunteer inside screamed as the walls bent inward, but the sound was lost in the assault. Roaring wind dot at the control tent. Everyone watched helplessly. The screens flickered, some going black as devices failed. One technician shouted that the storm was approaching the red zone, meaning total structural failure was possible. Another yelled that they had lost contact with nearly every volunteer. Panic filled the tent, but no one could do anything except hope the situation wouldn't turn disastrous. Elias, still inside the plant, began to feel the storm's rhythm. Through the Succulent's walls, a deep pulsing like the heartbeat of the desert. He stayed calm, sitting quietly with his hand flat against the wall. The plant continued absorbing the impact of the storm in a way that amazed him. It felt like being inside the safest part of a living creature that knew how to survive. The walls of the Succulent grew cooler, then warmer, shifting temperature slightly as if adjusting itself to maintain balance. Elias whispered to himself, trying to understand what the plant was doing. It wasn't fear he felt, just curiosity mixed with respect. It was clear now that the plant was far more resilient than they had realized. Hours passed. The storm outside raged stronger than ever. Shelters collapsed one by one, buried under heavy dunes forming rapidly in the wind's path. Some were crushed by flying debris. Some simply vanished into the fog of sand. The people inside them huddled down, covering their heads and praying their structures wouldn't give in. The Succulent, though, stood firm. Its deep roots anchored it tightly, and its thick outer layers flexed without cracking. Sand piled around it, but the plant's curved shape allowed the dunes to slide away instead of piling too deeply. Inside, Elias barely felt the violence of the storm. Only slight movements, soft creaks, and gentle shifts in pressure reached him. At one point, the storm's intensity pushed the plant sideways a few inches, but even then, it did not break. It simply adjusted, absorbing the motion like a flexible tower. Elias felt the tilt and braced himself, but the plant quickly returned to its normal position. He was in awe. As night approached, the storm slowly began to weaken. The desert outside was unrecognizable, buried in layers of sand, scattered equipment, and broken structures. The volunteers in the engineered shelters were frightened, unsure if it was finally safe to step outside. They reached for their communication devices, but most were dead. The control tent was half destroyed, its roof partly torn, its screens dark. The researchers waited anxiously, dust covering their faces and clothes. When the wind finally softened, they gathered their emergency gear and prepared to search for survivors as soon as visibility improved. Inside the Succulent, Elias sat quietly, listening as the rumbling faded. He touched the plant's inner wall with gratitude. Somehow, it had been the safest shelter in the entire experiment. He didn't know what had happened outside, only that something huge had passed. But he could sense from the plant's slow relaxation that the danger was fading. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his thoughts. He had entered the plant to study it. He had never expected it to save him. The desert looked nothing like the place the researchers had seen that morning. When the sun finally began to rise again, light spread slowly across a landscape changed almost beyond recognition. The dunes had shifted into new shapes, tall ridges standing where flat ground once existed. Some areas looked like they had been carved by giant hands. The air was still heavy with dust, giving the whole world a faded brownish color. It was quiet, too quiet, after the chaos of the night. Inside the Succulent, Elias felt the silence first. It was the kind of silence that comes right after something huge has passed. He opened his eyes slowly, unsure how long he had slept. The air inside the plant felt heavy, but safe, warm, but not uncomfortable. He could hear drops of water sliding slowly along the plant's inner walls. The storm had made the plant work hard to protect itself, and now it seemed to be settling. Into a resting state, Elias sat up, stretching his arms and rubbing his eyes. His muscles felt stiff from staying curled up for so many hours. He checked his oxygen monitor. The numbers were a little lower than before, but still safe. He took a deep breath and listened carefully for sounds from outside. At first, he heard nothing. Then slowly, he picked up a faint whistle wind moving softly across the dunes. He crawled toward the opening of the plant. Sand had piled up around the entrance, creating a small mound he had to push his way through. When his hand touched the outside air, he felt how dry and cool it was. He pushed harder until his head came out of the opening. The sight shocked him. The entire testing ground was buried. Structures that had once stood tall were now either completely gone or covered in heavy layers of sand. The place looked like a different world. The control tent was half collapsed. The communication towers were knocked over. The drones that had been flying earlier lay broken in the sand like fallen insects. The bright flags marking different test areas were nowhere to be found. Elias blinked a few times, trying to take it all in. He felt a knot form in his stomach. Something very serious had happened. This wasn't a normal desert storm. This was something else stronger, more unpredictable, almost unnatural in its suddenness. He crawled fully out of the succulent and stood up slowly. His legs felt wobbly, but after a moment he steadied himself. The sun was rising behind dunes, making the sand glow softly. Elias looked around for signs of the other volunteers, but he saw none. There were no footprints, no movement, not even voices calling out in the distance. For a moment, a cold fear slipped through him. Was he the only one left? Did everyone else make it? He tried to push the thought away. He couldn't jump to conclusions. The storm had scattered everything, so people could be hiding behind dunes or still inside their shelters. He brushed sand off his clothes and placed his hand gently on the succulent's outer wall. "Thank you," he whispered without thinking. The plant stood strong, still rooted firmly in the ground. Its surface was a little scratched from all the sand and debris, but it remained intact. Elias felt grateful in a way he couldn't express with simple words. He started walking toward what was left of the testing site. His steps sank slightly into the loose sand. He kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for movement. The air felt strange, thin, but calm, like the desert was holding its breath after releasing all its force during the storm. As he reached the first collapsed shelter, he knelt beside it, calling softly. "Is anyone inside?" He tapped gently on the metal. "Frame." No answer. The structure had been crushed almost flat. He didn't try to move anything yet. He wasn't sure if shifting the metal could cause more collapse. He moved to another shelter. This one was buried almost completely, with only the corner of its frame visible. Elias dug for a minute with his hands, trying to uncover the entrance. The sand was heavy and tightly packed. He called out again, hoping to hear anything. But the only sound was the faint rustle of sand sliding down the pile. He stood up and took a deep breath, trying not to panic. He had to stay calm. The researchers would be searching too. They would come. He just needed to find a way to signal, or find someone else who survived. He turned his attention to the control tent, which was half collapsed, but still partly upright. He walked over and pushed through the sagging entrance flap. Inside, the equipment was covered in dust. Screens were broken. Cables were tangled on the ground. Papers were scattered everywhere. It smelled like sand, plastic, and faint electricity. "Hello?" Elias called out. He stepped over some fallen pieces of metal, carefully scanning the space. Then he froze. In the corner, Half buried under the fallen frame of a table, he saw movement. His heart jumped. Someone was there. He rushed forward and knelt. A technician lay underneath the debris, conscious but weak. Elias quickly removed the lighter pieces and gently helped the man sit up. The technician coughed, dust escaping his mouth in soft bursts. You're alive," the technician whispered, staring at Elias with disbelief. His voice was rough, as if he had been breathing in sand for hours. "So are you?" Elias replied, relieved. "Are you hurt? My leg may be twisted. But I'm okay. Others, I don't know. Most equipment went dead when the storm hit." Elias helped the technician lean against a stable piece of metal. The man removed a cracked headset from around his neck and tossed it aside. "We lost contact with all the shelters," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We couldn't see anything. Couldn't reach anyone. We thought—" He stopped himself. Elias didn't need him to finish the sentence. "I need to look for the others," Elias said softly. The technician nodded. "Be careful. The sand is unstable in some places." Elias found a wooden pole inside the tent and used it as a marker, placing it upright outside the tent in the sand. It might help other survivors find them later. He walked toward another row of testing shelters. Each one was damaged differently. Some were crushed on one side. Some were flipped. Some were missing entirely. Elias continued calling out, tapping, digging, listening, doing anything he could to check if someone was inside. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat increased, but he kept going. Sweat gathered on his forehead as he dug through another mound of sand. When he reached the metal surface of the shelter underneath, he knocked again. This time, he heard a faint sound. Elias's heart raced. He pressed his ear to the surface. Someone was inside. He shouted loudly, "Hold on. I'm here." He dug faster, using both hands, pushing the sand aside. A muffled voice answered him, weak but alive. When he finally uncovered the door, he pulled it open with effort. Inside, a volunteer sat curled up, covered in dust but breathing. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. I thought no one would come." "You're safe now," Elias said gently. He helped her climb out, supporting her as she stood. She was trembling, her legs unsteady. He guided her toward the control tent, where the technician waited. As they walked, she kept glancing back at the blown-apart testing site. "Everything's gone," she whispered. "It was like the world was shaking. I thought the shelter would fold on top of me." Elias didn't know what to say. No words felt big enough for what they had gone through. Back at the tent, they gave her water and let her rest. Elias wiped sand from his face and turned back toward the dunes. He wasn't done. There were more shelters, more people, more chances to find survivors. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought remained. If he had been anywhere except inside that ancient plant, he might not be standing there now. The giant succulent had protected him in a way no man-made structure had managed. And as Elias walked back into the sand-covered field, he couldn't shake the feeling that the desert had just revealed something important, something humans had overlooked for too. Elias stood in the middle of the ruined testing field, looking at the giant waves of sand that had swallowed almost everything. The sun was warmer now, and the wind was soft, as if the desert felt tired after the storm it had released the night before. For a long moment, Elias simply listened to the quiet. It felt strange. After running around, helping survivors and checking shelters, the silence felt almost heavy. He took a deep breath and headed toward the far side of the field, where the last few shelters had been placed. He hadn't reached them yet. Most of the volunteers who had survived were resting near the damaged control tent. A few people could walk on their own, while others were sitting on the ground, still in shock. The technician he rescued earlier kept checking a broken device, hoping it would suddenly come back to life. But deep inside, everyone knew it wouldn't. Elias continued walking, pushing through the thick sand. Every few steps, his boots sank deeper than expected. The storm had loosened the ground, making it uneven and unpredictable. He used a long metal rod he'd found earlier to test the ground in front of him before stepping forward. The last thing he needed was to fall into a hidden dip or a soft patch of sand dot as he walked. His eyes caught sight of something familiar in the distance, the large green shape of the giant succulent. Even from far away, it stood tall and strong, untouched by the storm. Seeing it made Elias feel a strange mix of comfort and curiosity. It was the one thing that had behaved exactly the way nature intended. Everything else had failed, and the truth was, Elias still didn't understand how the plant had endured something so powerful, but he would think about that later. Right now, he needed to check every remaining shelter. He reached the first one, or what was left of it. Only a bent metal frame remained, sticking out of the sand like broken ribs. He tapped on it gently with his rod and listened. No sound came. Back. He looked around, searching for footprints or signs of movement, but there was nothing. He moved to the next shelter. This one was larger, built from a flexible material meant to withstand strong winds. But the storm had torn it apart. Fabric lay tangled in the sand. Elias kneeled and brushed sand away from the entrance. "Is anyone there?" he called softly. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He stood up and continued. Walking, the sun climbed higher, warming the back of his neck. Sweat gathered at his hairline, running down the side of his face, but he didn't stop. He felt responsible, not because anyone asked him to be, but because he knew he was one of the few who still had the strength to move around. His night inside the plant had given him energy, while everyone else had barely survived inside collapsing shelters. A few minutes later, he reached one of the last shelters on the far edge of the field. This one was tilted sideways, half buried. The entrance was blocked by a heavy chunk of metal from another broken structure. Elias pushed it aside slowly, grunting as the weight shifted. His feet slid in the sand, but he managed to move it enough to reach the door. He tapped twice, then pressed his ear against the metal dot at first. Nothing dot, then dash very faintly. He heard a small sound, like a cough, or maybe a weak voice, his heart. Jumped dot, he knocked again. "I'm outside," he said loudly. "Can you hear me?" A faint voice answered, muffled by the thick walls. Elias couldn't make out the words, but it was enough. Someone was alive. He dug faster, clearing sand from around the entrance. His fingers burned from the friction, but he kept going. He used his metal rod as a shovel, loosening the heavier clumps. After several minutes of hard work, he finally managed to pull the door open. Inside, a volunteer sat hunched over, shaking. His face was pale, and his clothes were covered in dust. When he saw Elias, he let out a breath that sounded like a mixture of relief and disbelief. Elias helped him climb out slowly, supporting his weight. "Take your time," Elias said gently. "The ground is soft here." The volunteer nodded weakly. "I thought I wouldn't make it. The shelter kept shaking all night. I could hear metal bending. I didn't know if the walls would last." "You're safe now," Elias said, guiding him carefully toward the control tent dot. On their way back, they stopped twice because the man needed to rest. His legs were trembling and his breathing was uneven. Elias made sure not to push him too hard. When they finally reached the control area, the others looked up. A few of them sighed with relief when they saw another survivor. The technician immediately handed the volunteer a bottle of water and checked him for injuries. Elias sat down for the first time in hours. His body felt tired, but his mind was alert. He looked at the small group of survivors, dusty, exhausted, but alive. The storm had taken many things from them, but not everything. And although they were still shaken, they weren't giving up. A few minutes later, one of the researchers approached Elias. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was tangled with sand, but her eyes were sharp. "You're the one who slept inside the plant, right?" Elias nodded. She looked at him for a long moment. "You were the only one who didn't call for help during the storm. Your signal remained stable longer than anyone else's. Then it suddenly disappeared, so we feared the worst." "I was asleep through most of it," Elias said quietly, her eyebrows lifted. "Asleep? During that storm?" "The plant protected me," Elias replied. The researcher looked at him as if she didn't quite believe it. Then her gaze shifted toward the distant green shape of the succulent. "We need to study that plant more," she said. "It survived something that destroyed every engineered shelter we built." Elias nodded slowly. "It reacted to the storm. I could feel it moving, tightening. It adapted, like it knew what to do." The researcher looked thoughtful. "Nature is often smarter than our designs." As the day went on, more survivors were found. Not many, but more than they expected. A few volunteers had been able to crawl out of their shelters and hide behind dunes. Some had been knocked unconscious, but were still alive. A small group even managed to reach the edges of the field before the storm got too strong. Every time someone found another survivor, a small wave of hope moved through the group. They still had no communication with the outside world, but they now believed help was on the way. That evening, when the heat softened and shadows stretched across the sand, Elias walked back to the giant succulent. He placed his hand on its surface gently. The plant was warm, almost like it remembered everything that had happened. Elias sat down beside it, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe. For years, humans had tried to build shelters strong enough to survive the desert. Yet here stood a living organism, unchanged for centuries, quietly doing what humans could not. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Inside him, a deep truth formed, one he hadn't fully understood until now. Maybe the answers humans searched for weren't always in their inventions. Sometimes they were already growing quietly in the world around them. When the giant sandstorm finally passed, the desert slowly started to breathe again. The wind calmed down, the brown haze began to settle, and sunlight pushed through the last layers of dust drifting in the sky. It looked like the whole world was waking up from a nightmare. But the research team at the desert facility felt no relief. Their faces showed only fear and confusion, because they had lost contact with all their volunteers, and the facility itself had taken heavy damage. The moment the storm weakened, the emergency crew rushed out with masks and protective glasses. The ground outside looked like a new desert had formed overnight. Nothing was where it used to be. The wind had created tall waves of sand that covered equipment, shelters, solar panels, and metal structures. It was as if the storm had picked everything up, shaken it violently, and dropped it back in random places. Some of the team members whispered to each other, trying to stay calm. Others kept checking their trackers, hoping to see at least one signal, but the screens did not show anything. All volunteer trackers were silent. The emergency team split into groups and moved carefully across the area, digging through debris and searching for anything that remained. The artificial shelters. The scientists had designed each built with different materials to test desert survival were nowhere near the condition they were left in. Some were crushed, some were tilted and half buried, and a few were missing completely, carried away by the wind. The team had prepared for difficult conditions, but not for a storm of this scale. It was stronger than anything predicted, stronger than anything the region had seen in years. The team leaders kept telling everyone to stay focused, not lose hope, and continue checking every possible spot. Few people suddenly stopped when they noticed something unusual far from the facility. It wasn't part of any shelter or machine. It was something natural. Something green. One of the crew members pointed at it. Is that the succulent? Even from a distance, it was clear that the giant plant, the same huge succulent that the desert botanist had crawled into before the storm, was still standing. Dusty, scratched, and a little tilted, but still there. Compared to the twisted metal wreckage around it, the plant looked almost untouched. This immediately brought a spark of hope to the team. If the plant had survived, maybe someone else had. The crew hurried toward it, stumbling over the uneven sand. As they reached the succulent, they placed their hands on its thick outer skin. It was warm from the sun, but firm and solid. Inside, it gave a faint sound, almost like a slow heartbeat, created by the plant's natural pulses of water movement. They called out, knocking gently on its side, hoping for a response. At first, they heard nothing, just the quiet hum of wind, rolling across the dunes. Then someone put an ear against the plant and said, "Wait, I think there's movement inside." With renewed energy, they got to work. They didn't want to harm the plant too much, but there was no choice. They needed to open it. Using carefully chosen tools, they began cutting into one of its swollen outer lobes. The plant's walls were thick and filled with moisture. It took time and patience to make a large enough opening. As soon as the last layer was cut, a soft wave of humid air escaped. The inside smelled of earth and water, like fresh rain. And there, curled in the hollow space, was the missing botanist. He wasn't moving at first, and the team's breath caught in their throats. But as they stepped closer, one of them noticed his chest rising and falling slowly. Another shook his shoulder gently, and he finally opened his eyes. Squinting at the sudden light, he looked confused, almost as if he had just awakened from the deepest sleep of his life. His lips were dry, and his face showed clear signs of exhaustion. His clothes were damp from the constant humidity inside the plant, and his hair was stuck to his forehead. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. One of the rescuers offered him water immediately. He drank in small sips, blinking slowly, trying to understand what was happening around him. His breathing steadied, and color began returning to his face. Everyone around him let out a sigh of relief. "You're safe," one of the rescuers said, keeping their voice calm and comforting. "You made it," he nodded weakly. "The plant, it protected me," he whispered. "Everything outside, I could feel the storm shaking it, but inside, it was warm. It felt alive." The team listened closely, amazed by every word. They helped him out of the succulent's hollow space, supporting him carefully as he stepped into the sunlight. When he finally stood outside, he stared at the world around him. A desert looked completely different. There was no sign of the other shelters, no familiar landmarks, no traces of the test area he had seen the day before. He looked back at the succulent, placing one hand gently on its outer wall. "I didn't think I would see daylight again," he said softly. But this thing, it held together. The team wrapped him in a light blanket to protect him from the sun, then guided him toward the rescue vehicle. On the way back, he noticed every broken structure they passed. He recognized parts of the demolished shelters, and his expression grew more serious. He knew exactly what that meant. The plant had withstood something that every designed structure had failed to endure. At the facility's medical unit, he was checked carefully. His dehydration was mild, which surprised the doctors. The moisture inside the plant had kept him from drying out. His oxygen levels had dropped lower than ideal, but still safe. The stable temperature inside the succulent had prevented him from overheating during the worst part of the storm. The staff kept asking questions not to pressure him, but because they were trying to understand what exactly happened inside the plant. He told them everything he remembered: the sudden darkness when the storm hit, the shaking, the way the walls seemed to tighten as if the plant were protecting itself, the steady humidity, the thick air that he could still breathe, and the strange feeling of calm that surrounded him. He spoke slowly, with occasional pauses, reflecting on the experience as if it still didn't feel entirely real. Meanwhile, the rest of the research team surveyed the facility to assess the damage. Their faces grew pale as they realized that nearly all the shelters had collapsed. They had put years of ideas, engineering, and theoretical models into those structures, believing they would survive extreme desert conditions. And yet, a natural, living plant, the simple but massive succulent, had outperformed every modern design. One of the team leaders approached the botanist later that evening. She sat beside him while he rested, drinking warm tea. "You were the only one who chose the plant," she said quietly. "And somehow, it kept you alive when nothing else could." He smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of deep gratitude. "It's strange," he said. "We always think our inventions are stronger, but nature has had millions of years to figure things out." The leader nodded, tapping her fingers lightly on her notebook. "We're going to study that plant," she said, "not to copy it directly, but to learn from it. It clearly has secrets we never imagined." He agreed, feeling a sense of purpose replacing the earlier fear. The succulent had saved him, and now he felt responsible for sharing everything he had learned from the experience. News of the event spread quickly within the research community. Everyone wanted to know how a natural organism had survived something that destroyed large, carefully engineered shelters. Questions arose about the plant's structure, its water-storing abilities, its pressure-absorbing fibers, and its ability to regulate temperature. But more importantly, people were amazed by the idea that a living thing could protect a human in such extreme conditions. As the sun set over the desert that day, the giant succulent still stood quietly among the dunes, glowing slightly in the orange light. It looked peaceful, strong, and almost mysterious, as if it knew what it had done. And the man it had protected sat inside the facility, wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the sunset through the window. He felt humbled by everything he had gone through, by nature's strength, by the plant's shelter, and by the simple fact that he was still alive. He whispered softly to himself, "Thank you, not to the rescuers, not to the team, but to the plant that had become his unexpected guardian." And deep in the desert silence, the wind carried his words away, leaving behind only the soft glow of fading sunlight over a living giant that had survived one of the harshest storms the desert had ever seen. After the botanist was rescued, and the dust had finally settled across the desert, the research facility slowly returned to a quiet, steady rhythm. But even though the machines were running again, and the team was back to work, nothing felt the same. Something had changed forever. The story of the giant succulent and the man it had protected had already begun spreading far beyond the desert. Scientists from other countries sent messages. Reporters called nonstop. Even organizations that studied survival technology wanted to know what had happened out there. Inside the facility, people walked around with a new kind of energy. There was excitement, curiosity, and a little disbelief. The botanist stayed in the medical unit for a few days until he felt strong enough to walk easily again. Doctors checked him every morning, and each time they were surprised by how well he had recovered. He had been inside a plant for more than a full day during a severe desert storm, yet he showed no major health issues. His body had stayed cool, his breathing had remained steady enough, and the plant's humidity had kept him from drying out. One of the doctors even joked, "That plant took care of you better than our shelters could." The botanist smiled each time someone said something like that. He felt grateful, but he also felt a growing sense of responsibility. He knew the world would want answers clear, simple explanations for how a plant had done what advanced structures couldn't, and he was ready to help explain it all, not from pride, but from understanding that the natural world often held solutions humans hadn't imagined yet. On his first day outside the medical room, he walked slowly toward the observation deck. It was a glass-walled area where the team usually studied the desert landscape. The sky stretched endlessly in shades of blue and gold, and the sand shimmered like tiny crystals under the sun. Far in the distance, he could see the giant succulent, standing by itself. It looked peaceful, almost like a silent guardian watching over the land. He stood there for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. The moment he'd crawled inside the plant, the sound of the storm hitting from the outside, the way the walls had felt secure and steady, and the strange calmness he had sensed, almost as if the plant understood it needed to protect him. While he was lost in his thoughts, the head researcher walked in quietly and joined him. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood next to him, looking out at the same view. After a moment, she took a deep breath and said, "We're ready to begin the study, but we want you to be part of it." He turned toward her, surprised. "Me? You survived something none of us could have predicted," she said. "You experienced the plant from the inside. You felt how it changed during the storm. No one else can describe what that was like. We need your perspective." Her words carried respect, not pressure, not expectation, just genuine appreciation. He nodded slowly. "I'll help in every way I can." The research project began immediately. Teams collected samples from the outer layers of the succulent and studied them under microscopes. They measured the thickness of the walls, analyzed the water content, and tested the fiber strength. They compared it to different desert plants from around the world. Each time they ran a test, the results surprised them. The plant seemed to combine qualities of multiple species: water storage, temperature regulation, pressure resistance, air filtration, yet it remained incredibly simple in its natural design. The botanist sat with them during many of these sessions, answering questions about how the inside had felt. He described the cool, stable temperature, the slow movement of air, the moisture that kept the environment from getting too dry, and even the gentle tightening he had felt when the storm was at its strongest. The scientists listened carefully, taking notes and connecting his experiences with their data. The more they studied, the more they realized this plant wasn't just unusual. It was a model of natural engineering that humans had underestimated. Its thick outer layers absorbed wind pressure. Its water-filled interior acted like a cushion, keeping the temperature steady. Its fibers allowed just enough air circulation to prevent suffocation. And the structure was flexible enough to bend slightly without breaking. Someone in the research room finally said what everyone had been thinking. Nature built a shelter long before we even thought about making one. The botanist smiled at that. He couldn't help but feel a warm sense of connection to the plant. It had saved his life, and now it was inspiring something much larger. Within weeks, architects, environmental engineers, botanists, and survival experts visited the facility. They wanted to examine the succulent, learn from it, and explore how its natural design could be used to build safer shelters in extreme climates. They weren't trying to copy the plant exactly. Instead, they wanted to borrow its ideas' flexibility, pressure absorption, natural cooling, sustainable structure. The botanist guided many of these visitors. He spoke in simple words, not scientific jargon, because he wanted everyone from students to professionals to understand what made the plant special. When he retold his story, he spoke calmly, never adding drama, never exaggerating. The truth was already powerful enough. One afternoon, during a meeting, a young engineer asked him, What was the moment when you thought you wouldn't make it? He paused, thinking carefully. Actually, he said softly, there wasn't one. Not because I wasn't scared, but because the plant never gave me a reason to panic. Inside it, everything felt steady. Even when the storm was at its worst, the air around me stayed calm. I could feel the outside shaking, but the inside stayed gentle. It felt like the plant knew what to do. Everyone in the room fell silent. His simple description carried more meaning than any technical explanation. It reminded them that survival wasn't always about advanced technology. Sometimes it came from places humans rarely paid attention to: plants, water, natural instinct. The earth itself. Over time, the research team created the first designs inspired by the succulent. They made small models of shelters that used curved shapes instead of sharp angles, water-filled walls instead of empty spaces, flexible materials instead of rigid ones. They tested these designs in controlled wind tunnels, and the results were impressive. The new structures bent with the wind rather than fighting against it, exactly the way the plant had done. Every successful test sparked celebration inside the facility. But the botanist always reminded them that the true credit belonged to this plant. We're just learning, he said. Nature already figured it out. Meanwhile, the succulent outside continued growing quietly. The team never harmed it. They cared for it gently, watering it when needed, checking its health, and keeping its environment stable. The botanist visited it every morning, placing his hand on its outer wall. He felt a connection with it, not like a scientist studying a subject, but like someone greeting an old friend. Sometimes he sat beside it for long periods, thinking about the storm, about his survival, about how life could change in a single day. He felt grateful, not just for being alive, but for having witnessed something extraordinary, something that reminded him of the simple strength of the natural world. After several months, the research was ready to be shared with the world. Instead of sending out technical papers first, the team decided to create a simple, human story about the event, how one person survived against impossible odds because of a living plant, how nature taught scientists something new, and how a desert storm led to a new understanding of shelter design. The botanist helped write the story. He kept the language simple and honest, focusing on what he felt, what he saw, and what he learned. When the story was finally published, it reached millions of people around the world. Many readers were amazed. Others were inspired. And some simply felt hope that nature still had answers humans hadn't discovered yet. In the months that followed, the botanist continued working at the facility. He became the lead researcher on natural survival structures. But he never became proud or loud about his role. He stayed humble, always reminding others that he was just the person who happened to be inside the plant during the storm. The real hero, he believed, was the giant succulent. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the desert and painted the sky in warm colors, he stood beside the plant one more time. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of sand and warm air. He rested his hand on the plant's surface and whispered, "You changed everything." The plant stood silently, glowing gently in the fading light. It didn't need to respond. It had already spoken in the only way nature